This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So, welcome back after the summer recess, which managed to hit a few days in the 90s around here. And so we begin a new sequence. And I thought I'd do something a little strange this time, which is to start with a joke. I'm not a person who kind of actually has a great number of jokes in my repertoire, and I listen to jokes and I laugh at them, but I can never remember them. But I do remember this one, and I think you'll see that it has some relevance to the general topics. And it originates apparently from Tennessee somewhere, in the wisdom of the back there, and it concerns a game warden in a state park. And it comes to the attention of the game warden that fishing is going on in the lakes there, and that a particular fisherman seems to have the capacity to capture an enormous number of fish. And the game warden is very interested in this, and in the end, having been heard about this, he sees the guy come in, and sure enough, bottom of his boat is full of fish, and he seems to have had a very successful outing. So the game warden says to the fisherman, that's a very good thing you've got going there. And the fisherman says, yeah, I'm there, yeah. And the game warden says, how do you do it? And the fisherman said, well, it's just it's fairly easy. I just get the fish. And the game warden says, well, do you mind if I come with you? And next time you go out? And the fisherman says, well, okay, all right. And so next morning at 5 o'clock, game warden meets the fisherman, and they get in the boat and they go out into the lake. And they cruise around for a couple of hours, and the fisherman doesn't take out any of his rods, doesn't do anything. He just sort of cruises around for a couple of hours. And the game warden says, this is very strange. Well, what are you doing here? Oh, it's okay, says the fisherman. Things are getting okay. And after a couple of hours of doing this, suddenly the fisherman reaches into his pouch, pulls out a stick of dynamite, lights a fuse, and chucks it in the water. There's an explosion, boom. And all of these stunned fish foam to the surface, and the fisherman just sort of takes them in, scoops them up, puts them in the boat. And the game warden says, yeah, that's mighty impressive, he said, but it's illegal. It's illegal. You can't do that. It strictly says when fishing that you're supposed to fish with rod and line, and we don't accept this kind of thing. He says, so I'm going to have to arrest you when I get back in for violation of the state policies. And the fisherman says, well, yeah, okay, he says, and he reaches into his bag. And he pulls out another stick of dynamite, and he lights it, and he gives it to the game warden, and he says, now then, are you going to talk or fish? Now, this is a kind of an interesting thing, because I feel a lot of the time that I'm often in that situation of being asked, am I going to talk or am I going to fish? And the context in which I heard this joke was in itself interesting, because when I went to Johns Hopkins in 1969-70, I found myself embroiled in the anti-war movement as one of 4 faculty who were part of a kind of anti-war group with about 30 or 40 very talented and dedicated students. And as we all know, a small dedicated group can sometimes do much more damage to a system than a large, rather inert group. So we had a vigorous campaign against the military recruitment this is the middle of the Vietnam War, military recruitment and the activities of the ROTC. And we agitated and protested when the military officers came to do their recruiting activities, all kinds of things like that. And in the end, we pushed and we got a referendum. And the referendum really asked the question, should we get them, should we ban recruitment, military recruitment and ROTC activities on campus? And we won the referendum. And to our nice surprise, most of the liberals kind of woke up and said, oh, well, I guess that's not a good idea, so let's support it. So we won the referendum, and so we banned military from coming. And then suddenly one day we get a notification that there's an emergency meeting of the faculty assembly, which is called. And when we get there, it turns out that what's happened is the Pentagon has noticed that we have banned ROTC and military recruitment, and it then says, therefore, Johns Hopkins will no longer be accepted for federal grants. Well, it turns out that Johns Hopkins is basically a federal research university, and it has the highest federal money per capita of any university in the United States. So all of a sudden, we were faced with the fact that we would have to get this let recruitment come back, or we'd lose all this money. So we were asked to vote in the assembly on that, and it was obvious from what everybody said that everybody basically took the position, well, they didn't like this recruitment on campus and ROTC, but under the circumstances, there was no way we could possibly survive as a university or complete our activities without actually reinstating military recruitment and ROTC activities. So the vote went forward, and the four of us who were part of the coalition kind of voted against it. Everybody else voted for reinstatement. In a sense, I felt my vote was kind of a bit hypocritical in the sense that had I been the casting vote in a situation, that would have really put me on the thing. But I knew the vote was lost. So I could cheerfully vote against it as a sort of a symbolic gesture, and that's what I did. Well, this is again a classic case of being, in a sense, handed a stick of dynamite and told, well, you either agree or you keep on with your position. So that was a thing, but in a funny sort of way, our activities really did have an effect, because about 6 months later, the Pentagon actually suddenly ceased military recruitment on campus, and also specified that ROTC activities should not be directly on campus, but should be held off campus. So in a sense, we got the bans and that, but we had had to take the stick of dynamite. Now, this is how I feel very, very much about the Ukraine issue, and so I'm sort of blend that in here, because I would like to see genuine negotiations, a ceasefire, genuine negotiations. I would like to see the neutralization of the whole of Central Europe, which, in the famous formulations of Halford Mackinder, is regarded as the heart of the world island, and therefore a very, very significant strategic geopolitical area. I'd like to see it demilitarized. I would like to see NATO withdrawn from the borders of Russia, and shrunk back in return for the development of cast iron guarantees of the sort that the Russians had offered somewhere around 2010. They had actually even flirted with the idea of joining NATO and securing a peace pact that, at the time, they said would run from Lisbon to Vladivostok, where there was demilitarization going to go on. And this would, I think, have been something that should have been discussed back in 2010, but it was obviously not part of what the US had in mind. The US views NATO as one of its powerful instruments. It wants to empower it. It wants to increase it. And at worst, it kind of says increasing it is one of the ways to really stick it to what was the Soviet Union and is now Russia. At best, it's about going ahead with this strategic process of enlarging NATO sort of step by step under US control as part of the US kind of plan for its own form of global domination. So So that's the kind of thing I would like to see rescinded. And that's the sort of thing I would want to talk about. But then, when you talk about it, you then find yourself immediately handed the stick of dynamite and say, well, there are all these war crimes being committed, all this shelling is going on, all this fighting is going on, people are dying, and all the rest of it. What are you going to do? And you get stuck with this idea of, are you going to talk, or are you going to fish? Are you going to support the war? And so I find myself kind of very conflicted about that. On principle, I would say I don't support the war. I would want these other things to happen. I think we should be trying to create an anti-war movement and some way of settling things, and at the same time recognize that there are all kinds of things at stake in the Ukraine case. And on this point, I want to add something to what I talked about earlier, and this has cropped up in the podcasts and the blog of Michael Roberts. Now, I'm often arguing Michael Roberts over the falling rate of profit and things like that, but he has a very compelling blog with very important information in it, and he has a couple of blogs on Ukraine. And in one of them, he points out that there's much at stake in what's happening in Ukraine, and the way to set it up is to think about Ukraine as a productive entity within the global economy. And as a productive entity within the global economy, it has a very large portion of the global grain supplies, particularly wheat. And actually, Russia and Ukraine combined would account for about 40% of the world trade in wheat, for example, in wheat grains. And in a sense, you can say that one of the things that was a great interest to Russia in re-annexing Ukraine was that Russia plus Ukraine would control 40% of the world's grain supplies, in addition to which there are significant energy and mineral resources in the Ukraine, and that therefore, again, Russia had something to gain very much economically from reabsorbing the productive capacities of Ukraine into its own economy and its own, and that would contribute mightily to its own standing economically in a highly competitive world. So you can see this as possible, and what then happened was that, to the degree that the Russians were already controlling a good part of Ukraine, that part was the Donbass region, which is where all of the energy and mineral resources are concentrated. So it has already absorbed the energy and mineral resources into the Russian economy, and it was left with the agrarian resources, which are largely throughout the rest of the Ukraine, which is that part of the Ukraine which is resisting absorption into Russia. But here comes something which is rather interesting. Ukraine, like many other countries, is indebted, deeply indebted, and the debtor countries sort of had a meeting, as they sometimes do on a situation of this kind, and said basically they wouldn't forgive the debt of the Ukraine, but they would have a moratorium on repayments of the debt and payment of interest on the debt for 2 years. So, in a sense, Ukraine has been let off the hook in terms of repaying its debt, and that's very valuable. And in the statement on it, they kind of said, well, they look forward very much to international participation in the reconstruction of Ukraine in the event that the country survives and actually could return to its initial borders. But as part of this, it became pretty clear that one of the deals which was involved was that many people have been interested, not only on the Russian side, in expanding control over the wheat and grain and fertilizer kind of export trade, which is mainly set up in the west of Ukraine. So this one, what this did was to say that after the end of the Cold War and all of that went on in the 1990s, Ukraine found itself under considerable pressure. There was a lot of an attempt to sort of Western capital to move in and to take control, particularly over all the land resources. So Ukraine passed a law in, I think it was 2000, something of that sort, 2001, which actually banned foreign ownership of agricultural land, which meant that the multinational corporations from the West, who've been kind of lusting after it, were basically held at bay because they, you know. And at the same time, there were attempts to prevent the consolidation of the land, so that there's kind of a movement by oligarchs to consolidate land holdings into massive agrarian empires was also checked. In other words, the further neoliberalization of Ukraine was put on hold in 2000 by this legislation, which in effect kept the multinationals at bay and prevented the oligarchs from continuing to consolidate their power within Ukraine. Well, it seems that the current government in Ukraine is prepared now to kind of say, okay, they'll go back to the neoliberal game and they'll open up the land resources to foreign control, and they will open it up to the oligarchs and all the rest of it. So there's a deal going on right now that in return for good treatment on the part of the debtor of those that hold the debt and commercial support, Ukraine will actually release all of its resources so that the multinationals, the Western multinationals, and the oligarchs can actually consolidate their control over the wheat trade. So that's going on in the background. And one of the blogs that Michael Roberts puts out, he quotes the sorts of sources that tell this story very, very directly. So that all that's going on in Ukraine is not simply about fighting off the Russians. It's also about a competition for access to resources. It's also about making something happen, which will be to the advantage of Western multinationals, and therefore the Western multinationals support very strongly the continuation of the war. They support very strongly the giving of something like $4 billion, which, as I pointed out, most of which comes back to the United States in the sense that it goes to the manufacturers of the military armaments, which are being supposedly donated to Ukraine. So again, this is one of those cases where you see when you find out the details in the background, you say that this is not just simply a war between Ukraine and Russia over 15th century images and all the rest of it. This is a very tangible war over resources, and different groups have different interests and therefore are supporting the continuation of the war and the prosecution of the war to the point where it will take back, if it possibly can, that part of the Ukraine which Russia has controlled for some time, which is, at some point is likely to include the Crimea as well as the mineral and energy resources in the Donbass region. So the Europeans have a vested interest, and the United States has strong vested interest in the continuation of this war and the successful prosecution of this war in such a way as to actually then make Ukraine a more open territory for the kind of the neoliberalization that has been going on in most of Central and Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War. In other words, the shock therapy that was administered to Russia itself and all of the processes that went through the other countries to be reintegrated into the neoliberal kind of global system. Ukraine is now a site where there's a battle going on about that. So in part, interestingly, the battle over Ukraine can be seen as an attempt between two systems. One is the state-owned system, which is still very strongly present in China, and which is increasingly in alliance with Russia, and so that sort of state organized capital accumulation versus the corporate systems of the West. That what we're seeing is a battle between those two economic systems being fought out in the background to the actual military battle that's going on in Ukraine itself. And so there's a lot at stake here, economically as well as politically and geopolitically. So here's another angle, another wrinkle, if you like, and it comes back also to this kind of notion of, well, I don't want to see the abolition of all the state-owned enterprises that still exist in Ukraine and their crass privatization. I don't want to see the privatization of all of the agrarian resources. I don't want to see the privatization of what is going on in the Donbass region. So I don't want to see that happening. So but on the other hand, I find myself being handed the stick of dynamite and say, well, if you don't support the Ukrainians, you're supporting the Russians, and I don't want to support the Russians either. So that's why that story is, I think, so telling, because again and again, and I find myself in a situation where, in a way, I want to talk this way, but I'm handed a stick of dynamite, which means I have to go that way, which kind of, I suspect that my audience will have at various times have faced the same sorts of dilemmas. You want to do this, but the reality of the situation is you've got to do that, and you don't have any option. And this is a kind of an existential problem which crops up again and again and again, and it very much occurs politically. What you can do and say politically, and where you can go politically. Right now, it's very difficult to be critical of the war in Ukraine. As soon as you get there, people will jump all over you and say, you're supporting the Russians and they're violent, and yes, and I'm hating what the Russians are doing, and all of the accounts I hear of it. On the other hand, I also recognize that there are all these other elements entering into the situation, and that therefore, if we could get out of the situation somehow or other, and settle these elements in a different kind of way, this would make a very, very real difference. So the story, I think, has a moral to it, and it has a kind of real meaning to it. And as I say, I'm constantly finding myself sort of being handed the stick of dynamite and saying, are you going to, fish, play the game the way that it's being structured, or are you going to, maintain the purity and end up with absolutely nothing? This is something which I think most radicals will understand. Most people who've been struggling politically will understand, and therefore it's, I think, just useful to go back and tell the story and to realize what is involved. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.